No one at Lockridge Storage could explain why Unit 114 had sat untouched for nearly 8 years. It wasn't especially large, nor in a desirable location. In fact, it sat at the farthest corner of the property, where the concrete sloped slightly and the security lights flickered whenever the wind pressed too hard against the poles. Tenants came and went, units opened and emptied, some auctioned, others reclaimed. But Unit 114 remained exactly as it was. Locked, paid for on time, silent. The only detail anyone remembered was the day a single massive wooden crate was rolled inside, late at night, long after the office had closed, by a man no one recognized. The surveillance cameras on that side had been out for repairs that week, leaving only the vague impression of shadows moving under the moonlight. The next morning, the crate sat in the back of the unit, occupying almost the entire width of the room, as if it had grown there overnight. For years, the payments continued like clockwork. Then, without warning, they stopped. Certified letters were mailed, notices were posted, and the required months passed. Still no response. When the paperwork finally allowed the unit to be auctioned, the staff assumed it would draw a crowd. Who wouldn't be curious about a crate as big as a small car? But when the auction listing went live, the comments turned skeptical, even mocking. Probably empty. Probably mold. Probably a scam. Curiosity existed, yes, but courage was scarce. By the morning of the auction, only 7 bidders had signed up. 6 of them were there out of habit. Only one came with purpose. That one was Harold Whitman, a 72-year-old retired carpenter who understood wood in the same way some people understand music. He had spent his life building cabinets and rocking chairs, fixing porches, smoothing splintered edges, and coaxing life from boards forgotten in barns. Retirement, however, had left him adrift. His hands remembered the rhythm of work, but his days had grown still. He lived alone now in a modest 1-story house with a porch that needed new steps and a roof he wasn't sure he could afford to repair. Social Security covered the basics, but not much else. The storage auction had not been a dream of treasure. It had been a quiet hope for a project, something to bring back the sense of purpose he once carried like breath. When Harold arrived at the facility, he didn't expect anything remarkable. He expected the usual clutter of broken appliances and boxes full of college textbooks no one wanted. But when the door to Unit 114 rolled up halfway, revealing the outline of the giant crate in the back, something deep inside him tightened. The crate wasn't made like modern shipping containers. It wasn't plywood or cheap laminate. This was kiln-dried hardwood with dovetail corners and iron strapping aged just enough to hint at decades of existence. The boards were thick, the grain dark and tight, the lid secured with handmade nails rather than screws. Whoever built it knew the craft, not the hobbyist kind, but the kind that came from a lifetime of precision. Harold stepped closer as far as the auctioneer allowed, and felt a familiar pull in his chest. It reminded him of the first cedar chest he ever made at 19, and of his father's battered toolbox, and of the smell of linseed oil warming in a workshop during winter. The crate seemed to radiate a story even before it was open. He wasn't sure whether that story would lead anywhere, but his instincts, which had guided thousands of careful cuts and patient repairs, told him this was not an empty box. When the auctioneer called for the opening bid, $300, no one moved. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then, almost involuntarily, Harold raised his hand. He did not calculate, did not hesitate. He simply acted on the quiet certainty forming in his ribs. A second bidder lifted his number, but half-heartedly, as though only testing the waters. Harold lifted his again, firmer this time. The second bidder dropped out. The others remained still. The gavel came down with a resonant strike that echoed through the cold morning air. Sold. Unit 114 goes to number 12. Harold felt a strange mix of victory and dread. He had never spent $300 so quickly in his life. But as he stepped forward to sign the paperwork, something inside him steadied. Regret arrives quickly for most people his age, but purpose arrives only once in a while, and he recognized the difference. As the manager handed him the new lock and receipt, the man hesitated, lowering his voice as though worried someone might overhear. "If you need help moving that old crate, let me know," he said. "We all tried lifting it once. Didn't budge an inch. Whatever's in there, it's heavy." That detail, delivered with genuine concern, lodged itself in Harold's mind. What could weigh so much and yet be packed in a crate built by hand? Tools? Machinery? Stone? Or something else entirely? As he walked back toward the unit, he paused long enough to take in the scene. The flickering light, the quiet stretch of pavement, the breeze carrying dust across the concrete. Then he crossed the threshold into Unit 114, the air inside cool and faintly scented with old wood and time. He placed his hand on the crate, feeling the grain beneath his skin. It was smooth in some places, rough in others, and faintly warm from the weak sunlight filtering through the open door. A lifetime of knowledge whispered to him. This was no ordinary container. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing remarkable stories just like this one. And feel free to comment where you're watching from. Our community always loves seeing those messages. Harold stepped back, drew a slow breath, and tightened his grip on the pry bar he had brought in his truck. He wasn't a man who rushed things, not in his work, not in his life, not even now. But the moment had come. He knelt beside the crate, studied the joints, located the weakest point, and set the metal edge of the pry bar beneath the first board. The echo of metal against wood filled the unit like a clock beginning its countdown. He had no idea that the moment he lifted that lid, his quiet life, his predictable, measured days, would shift in ways he couldn't yet imagine. What waited inside the crate was not just a collection of objects. It was the beginning of a story he had unknowingly been walking toward for years. And as he leaned his weight into the bar, the wood gave a slow, reluctant groan, like a secret stretching awake after a very long sleep. When the first board finally came free, it did so with a long, reluctant sigh, as if the crate itself had grown used to keeping its secrets. Harold eased the lid up slowly, setting the plank aside instead of letting it drop. Years of careful work in other people's homes had trained him to move like that. No sudden gestures, no wasted motion. Dust floated up in a thin, lazy ribbon, lit by the pale strip of daylight slipping under the unit door. He blinked against the sting in his eyes and looked inside. What he saw at first wasn't treasure. It was work. The entire top layer of the crate had been packed with wooden pieces wrapped in canvas and old flannel shirts. He lifted one bundle and unrolled it on the concrete. Inside lay a carved door panel, no bigger than a cutting board, its surface alive with vines and leaves so delicate it made his own best efforts through the years feel clumsy by comparison. The edges were chamfered by hand, not machine, the kind of detail you only bother with when you expect someone to run their fingers along the grain. Another bundle held a set of curved chair legs, roughed out but not sanded, each one marked with faint pencil lines like a map of what they would become. There were templates cut from thin plywood, patterns traced, notes scribbled in tiny lettering along the edges. It was as if someone had tried to fit an entire workshop's active projects into one giant box. Harold felt a strange, quiet recognition as he unwrapped each piece. The man who had built this crate hadn't just known wood. He had spoken its language fluently. The joinery was careful, the packing methodical. Tools had been tucked in with the same care as finished work. Under the carved panel he found a set of chisels wrapped in oiled cloth, their handles worn smooth from years of use. He picked one up and tested the balance in his palm. It felt right, like a handshake from someone who knew what they were doing. The deeper he dug into the crate, the more it began to feel like he was unpacking a life rather than a stash. There were jars of old brass screws, separated by size, each labeled in neat handwriting. A collection of hand planes, some older than he was, had been cared for like family, irons sharpened, saws waxed, each one wrapped in brown paper. An entire roll of sandpaper sheets had been sorted by grit and secured with twine. The crate smelled like time in a way that tugged at Harold's chest, oil, wood dust, a faint trace of tobacco, the ghost of varnish. He was so absorbed that he almost forgot the original question. Why had everyone struggled to move this crate if so much of it was wood and tools? He had emptied enough weight to feel the difference, and yet when he shifted his shoulder against the side and pushed, the box barely budged. Something below what he could see still held stubborn mass. He decided not to jump ahead. Years of working on sagging porches and leaning fences had taught him that the only way to understand a structure was one piece at a time. He set the tools aside in careful rows on an old moving blanket, separating the things that needed cleaning from those that simply needed a new home. Under a stack of cabinet doors he found a narrow wooden box with a sliding lid. Inside lay envelopes, receipts from lumberyards, handwritten notes from clients, old invoices folded twice. Names he didn't recognize appeared beside addresses in neighborhoods he knew were far from cheap. Custom built-ins, Brentwood, Restoration, Maple Avenue, Lakeview, dining table, commission, mahogany, deposit received. The date stretched back 20-30 years. It dawned on him gradually that the man behind this crate had once made his living from the kind of work that most people now ordered from catalogs and big box stores. Bespoke, custom, built to last longer than the houses it lived in. Somewhere along the way work like that had gone out of fashion, but whoever this fellow had been, he hadn't stopped doing it. He had simply started packing it away. Harold sat back on his heels, the receipt book balanced in his hand. There was something almost painful in the thought of such care ending up here, abandoned in a metal room behind a flickering light. It reminded him of friends from his trade, men who could cut a mortise joint by eye and measure by the spread of their fingertips, now living in apartments with nothing left of their skills but stories. A quiet anger stirred in him, not at any one person, but at the way the world could forget hands like these. If you've ever known someone whose craft mattered more than their paycheck, a father who fixed everything, a grandmother who sewed without patterns, then you understand why Harold kept going even when his knees complained. Stories like his are why we share these tales at all, so if this is touching a memory for you, consider tapping like and subscribing. It helps more than you think and keeps these small, honest lives from disappearing entirely. He found personal details only in hints. A snapshot had slipped between two bundles, a faded Polaroid of a man in his 60s standing in front of a finished dining set, one hand resting on the polished table, the other holding a cigarette. His face was unsmiling, but his posture told a different truth, a modest pride in work done right. On the back, a neat note read, "Delivery March 1999, finished at last." No name, no address, no family in the frame. Just the man and the furniture. After an hour, the unit floor near the door looked like a catalog of possibilities. Chair legs, cabinet faces, tool rolls, measuring jigs, and odd little jigs only a seasoned woodworker would understand lay in orderly lines. The crate was half empty now, at least from what he could see. Yet when Harold braced himself and gave the side another cautious shove, it barely shifted more than an inch. He frowned, straightened up slowly, and measured the outside of the crate with his tape. Then, kneeling, he measured the inside height from the rim to the boards he could see at the bottom. The numbers didn't match. He checked again to be sure. The exterior was deeper by several inches. Experience prickled at the back of his neck. It was a small discrepancy, one most people would dismiss as rough measuring. But Harold had spent decades making sure cabinet doors hung level and stairs didn't betray a traveler's foot. He knew what a half-inch looked like from across a room. This gap was more than that. He rapped his knuckles lightly against the visible floorboards inside the crate. The sound that came back wasn't quite right for solid planking resting on concrete. It wasn't hollow exactly, but there was a muted quality to it, like a drumhead stretched over something dense. He walked around the crate, tested the outside boards near the bottom, listening. The echoes differed from side to side, as if the crate had a story hidden within its own bones. That realization brought with it a rush of possibilities he didn't allow himself to name yet. Hidden compartments were the stuff of television shows and dime novels, not the realities of a retired man in a drafty storage unit. Still, something had been built into this crate beyond what he could see. The thought followed him all the way home. On the drive back, his small pickup rattled softly under the lighter load of tools and pieces he'd decided to bring home first. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows over the two-lane road. Houses slipped by in slow succession. Porches with peeling paint, tidy lawns, wheeled bins lined neatly at the curb. He passed his own little house, noting again the curling edge of the roof shingles, the step that flexed just enough to make him worry when grandchildren visited. He had been telling himself for years that he would fix both soon, but soon never stretched quite far enough to reach the price of lumber and a hired helper. He backed into his driveway and unloaded the tools into his garage, placing the choicest pieces on his old workbench and leaning the carved boards against the wall where he could study them later. The familiar sense of his own shop, sawdust, old coffee, a trace of solvent, wrapped around the newly discovered items like an embrace between strangers who realize they share a history. Standing there, surrounded by the remnants of another man's craft, Harold felt less alone than he had in a long time. His daughter called that evening as she did most Sundays. She asked about his health, his church friends, the weather. He mentioned the storage auction carefully, not emphasizing the money he had spent. She scolded him gently for dragging home more projects, then laughed in that fond, exasperated way adult children sometimes reserve for parents who still surprise them. Beneath her teasing, however, lived a concern he understood too well. She worried about his finances even more than he did. The roof, the medical bills, the rising cost of everything. For her, the idea of a mysterious crate sounded like another risk in a life that had already carried its share. He didn't tell her about the weight that still remained in the unit, or the hollow notes from the crate's false bottom. He didn't mention the coins he suspected might exist, or the hidden valuables that so many storage stories seem to promise. Not because he wanted to keep secrets, but because he didn't yet know whether there was anything to tell. Hope is a fragile thing at 72. It needs evidence before it can be spoken aloud. The next morning, he was back at Lockridge Storage before the office officially opened. The manager, seeing him through the glass, waved him in anyway. They exchanged a few words about the weather and the football scores. As Harold turned to leave, the manager hesitated, then added almost casually that when the staff had tried to move that crate years earlier, before they knew better, they had rolled a scale under one corner just to see what they were dealing with. Came out just under 800 pounds, he said, shaking his head. And that was before you took anything out of it. Whoever packed it had something serious in there. Or they built the thing out of lead. The figure hung in Harold's mind long after he walked back down the corridor. 800 pounds. There was no way the wood and tools he had removed accounted for all of that. The crate, even half emptied, still resisted movement like a stubborn tree stump. He slipped inside Unit 114, closed the door most of the way to keep the chill out, and knelt again by the crate. This time he approached it not as a container but as a puzzle. He ran his fingertips along the interior corners, feeling for seams that didn't quite line up. He pressed gently against the boards, testing for play that shouldn't exist in a properly built base. In the front right corner, just where the grain shifted direction, his thumb brushed over a nail head that wasn't quite the same as the others. Slightly smaller, set just a little deeper, more like a dowel than a fastener. He froze, then checked the opposite corner. They're a twin. 2 more at the back. 4 points that, viewed from above, formed a smaller rectangle inside the crate's footprint. The kind of rectangle you might cut if you wanted to create a hidden panel that could be lifted out by someone who knew exactly where to pull. He felt his pulse beat a little faster in his ears, not the wild gallop of youth, but the deliberate, measured thud of an old heart waking to possibility. Something lay beneath those boards, something the builder of this crate had not wanted just anyone to reach. It might be nothing more than extra stock, dense hardwood, perhaps, or old iron weights used to stabilize the box. But it might be something else, something that explained the missing years of payments, the sudden silence, the 800 pounds of resistance. Harold sat back, wiped his palms on his jeans, and looked around the dim unit. For the first time he was aware of how quiet it was on this back row, how far the security camera at the corner really sat, how easily someone could slip in unnoticed if they knew when the office staff took their lunch breaks. The thought didn't frighten him exactly, but it sharpened his sense of being watched, even if only by the years themselves. He turned his attention back to the strange pattern of hidden fasteners and faint seams. This was no accident. This was a decision someone had made a long time ago, likely for a reason that was still waiting at the bottom of that box. And as he reached for his pry bar again, this time aiming not at the lid, but at the narrow gap between the apparent floor and the crate's side, he understood that whatever lay beneath was not just going to answer his questions. It was going to change the questions entirely. Harold had pried apart enough stubborn cabinets in his lifetime to know the difference between a board that ought to move and one that was pretending not to. The false floor inside the crate belonged to the second kind. It resisted with the steady, unnatural firmness of something built to endure time, weather, and perhaps even unwanted hands. He wedged the flat end of the pry bar beneath the faint line in the wood, then paused, letting his breath settle. Nothing about the crate felt rushed. It demanded the kind of patience he used to save for dovetail joints and wedding gifts he carved for neighbors. The quiet of the storage unit pressed in around him, broken only by the hum of a flickering fluorescent light farther down the corridor. He leaned a little more weight into the bar, and the faintest creak whispered upward, just enough to confirm that the seam wasn't decorative. It was real. And whatever lay underneath had been hidden with intention. He took his time widening the gap. Every few inches he stopped, brushed away sawdust, and searched for signs of rot or moisture damage. There were none. The wood beneath was smooth, clean, almost too well kept for something sealed away this long. When one section finally lifted enough for him to slide his fingers under, he pressed down on the opposing corner to check for give. Held firm. This wasn't a loose piece that had shifted with age. It was a panel engineered to sit flush and disappear. Whoever built this wasn't hiding scraps or sentimental trinkets. They were concealing something meant to stay in place until a specific pair of hands found it again. Before pulling the panel free, Harold set down the pry bar and straightened his back, letting his spine unkink from the crouched hours he had spent in the unit. Movement outside caught his ear, just the distant clang of a rolling door, followed by voices fading toward the main office. The facility was busier today than when he first won the auction, but this back row still sat mostly forgotten. The remoteness, once a convenience, now pressed on him. It made him aware of how alone he was with a crate no one had managed to lift, a crate built by someone methodical enough to create a secret compartment that weighed hundreds of pounds long before he touched it. He lifted the panel slowly, half expecting a rush of stale air or the smell of trapped varnish. Instead, the cavity beneath revealed itself in gradual layers. The interior wasn't deep, perhaps 8 inches, but the contents were arranged with such precision that the sight made him go still. Thick canvas bundles, each tied with heavy twine, lay in perfect rows. Not one was loose. Not one had shifted. The arrangement was so exact that it looked almost like medical supplies or archival materials rather than something packed by a craftsman. He touched the nearest bundle with 2 fingers. The canvas was stiff, as if treated with something to resist moisture. He slid it toward him and felt the weight, dense and compact, far heavier than any woodworking item could be. A knot tightened low in his chest. Not fear exactly, but an awareness that the story of this crate was stepping out of the world he understood. Inside this hidden compartment might be one of 3 things. Something valuable, something dangerous, or something personal enough to make a man hide it beneath layers of labor. And people rarely go to such lengths over anything ordinary. He loosened the knot of twine and unfolded the canvas. Inside lay another layer of cloth, this one softer, wrapped around a rectangular object about the size of a shoebox but far heavier. As he uncovered it inch by inch, dark metal revealed itself, dull from age but clearly well engineered. For a moment he couldn't place what he was looking at. Then the shape registered, the hinge, the rivets, the small recessed handle. It was a lockbox. A proper one. The kind banks used before safety deposit boxes became digital records and barcodes. The metal was cold under his hand, and the box emitted the faint scent of old paper and machine oil. A small brass plate near the latch bore no name, only a number etched by hand in a script so steady it nearly seemed printed. He set the lockbox aside gently, then reached for the next canvas bundle. It was the same size, the same weight, tied the same way. A third matched the first 2 exactly. A fourth was slightly thicker but still uniform. 6 identical bundles in total, each arranged in the cavity like drawers fitted inside a desk. Beneath them, the cavity floor was lined with tar paper, another detail that told him the creator of this crate planned long-term storage, not a quick concealment. Harold felt something between awe and unease. The crate, the craftsmanship, the methodical packing, it all pointed to a person who built order around whatever chaos his life held. That kind of person doesn't abandon thousands of hours of work or leave behind metal lockboxes unless something had gone very wrong. Retirement had made Harold quieter, more reflective, and in the stillness he had learned to pay attention to the instincts he once ignored. Right now, those instincts whispered that this wasn't just a discovery. It was an inheritance of a story someone hadn't been able to finish. He loaded the bundles into the truck one by one, lining the bed with moving blankets so the metal wouldn't scrape. Before closing the unit for the day, he photographed the cavity, the panel, and the crate's interior from multiple angles. It wasn't paranoia, it was documentation, something he had always taught his apprentices back when he still had them. Document what you find. Someday you'll be glad you did. Now he was taking his own advice. As he drove home, the weight in the bed of the truck felt like a passenger leaning forward, listening. The sun dipped behind low clouds, tinting the world in shades of copper and gray. Traffic thinned. The hum of the engine steadied his breathing. And yet, every few miles he checked his rearview mirror, not for cars tailing him. He hadn't yet let his imagination travel that far, but to reassure himself the bundles were still secure. Discoveries like this, he thought, have gravity. They change the shape of whatever they touch. If you're still following Harold's story and you feel that familiar pull, the one where something ordinary turns into something quietly extraordinary, tap like and subscribe. These journeys mean more when shared with people who understand the weight and wonder of unexpected second chances. At home, he brought the bundles into the garage, one careful trip at a time. The lockbox he set on the workbench nearest the old lamp whose warm light softened the room's edges. Dust motes spun slowly around its beam, settling on the surface of the metal like a blessing or a warning depending on the angle. He sat for a moment, palms resting flat on the bench, letting his heart slow from the strain of lifting what felt like half a lifetime carried in pieces. He didn't open the lockbox that night. Something in him, a sense of respect, of caution, of the old belief that some things need the right time to reveal themselves, told him he wasn't ready yet. Instead, he labeled each bundle with masking tape, noting their weight and placement in the crate. Then he locked the garage door, double-checked the deadbolt, and turned out the light. As he walked back into the quiet of his house, he felt a shift, small but unmistakable. Not the thrill of treasure hunting or the fear of danger, but the awareness that tomorrow would ask something different of him. Something that might reach farther back than the crate itself. And as he lay in bed that night, listening to the old clock tick in the hallway, Harold felt the same thought return again and again, steady as the second hand. Whatever this man hid, he didn't hide it alone. Something, or someone, had shaped the need for secrecy. And the next layer of truth was waiting in one of those locked metal boxes. Harold had always believed that quiet days protected a man from trouble, yet the morning after he found the small steel lockbox inside the huge wooden crate felt anything but quiet. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the world had begun to listen more closely than he was comfortable with. He set the lockbox on the workbench in his garage, placing it gently on an old towel so the cold metal wouldn't scrape the wood. The surface carried faint scratches that looked intentional rather than random, and the weight suggested something denser than documents or tools. He stood there for a long moment, his hands braced on the bench, trying to remember the last time he had felt such a mix of anticipation and unease. Retirement had softened the urgency in his days, but now it felt as though urgency had returned on its own terms, without invitation. He fetched his reading glasses and a small flashlight, convinced that if he studied the lockbox long enough, it would tell him the shape of its secret. But no amount of staring changed the fact that it had no keyhole in the usual place, only a recessed groove on the underside that looked like it required a very specific tool. Harold attempted to pry the groove open with a flat driver, but the metal barely shifted, and he forced himself to stop before damaging something that might be extremely valuable or, far worse, deeply sensitive. That was the moment he admitted that whatever lay inside had not been hidden for convenience. It had been hidden with purpose, and people who conceal things with purpose often expect those things to remain sealed. He stepped back, exhaled slowly, and reminded himself that curiosity at his age needed to be tempered with caution. He brushed the sawdust from his sleeves and tried to return to his normal tasks, yet his attention refused to settle. Even as he swept the garage floor or straightened the shelves, a part of his mind kept drifting toward the box and the strange, precise items he had already found inside the crate. He could not help recalling how the facility manager had mentioned that the unit had been paid late multiple times, each payment coming at the last possible moment, almost as though the owner wanted to keep possession without ever setting foot inside again. Now, with the crate open and its contents half-sorted, those details began to look less like coincidence and more like a quiet pattern of avoidance. In the early afternoon, Harold decided to take a short break and walk to the front porch, letting the sunlight steady his thoughts. The neighborhood stretched out in its usual hush, trimmed lawns, neatly parked cars, windows reflecting the autumn glare. Yet something felt subtly out of place, though he couldn't name it at first. Only after several minutes did he notice the dark sedan parked halfway down the block, its windows tinted just enough to obscure the interior. It wasn't unusual for visitors to park on the street, but this particular car had not been there earlier, and it seemed deliberately angled toward his driveway. He tried to dismiss the thought, but the sensation lingered like a cold fingertip trailing down the back of his neck. Instead of returning to the garage, he went inside the house, closed the door gently, and stood in the kitchen until the quiet settled again. He reminded himself that he was letting his imagination outrun reason. But as he poured a cup of tea, another thought crept in, unwanted but steady: valuable secrets never remain alone for long. If someone had hidden something inside that crate so carefully, perhaps someone else was looking for it now. By late afternoon, he forced himself back to work, sorting the items from the crate one by one. He cataloged everything in long, steady lines of handwriting, placing each object into carefully labeled bins. Yet every few minutes, the image of that sedan returned to him, hovering just behind his focus like a shadow cast in the wrong direction. As the daylight thinned, he stepped out to bring the bins inside and noticed that the car had disappeared. The relief he expected didn't come. Instead, he felt the subtle, unpleasant awareness that whoever had been sitting inside that vehicle had left because they chose to, not because they had finished their business near his house. That evening, Harold sat at the dining table, the lockbox between him and the lamplight, its edges catching faint reflections. He considered leaving it untouched until morning, but the idea of waiting filled him with more anxiety than action. He retrieved the wooden crate's largest lid panel, the one with faint carvings along the inside seam, and examined it carefully. He traced the marks with his fingertips and noticed that one carved line had a slight indentation deeper than the rest. When he pressed gently, the wood clicked, revealing a small compartment carved flush against the grain. Inside lay a thin metal tool, oddly shaped, as though designed to fit precisely into the groove beneath the lockbox. He felt the rush of discovery move through him, not joyous but heavy. People hide things inside layers when they never intend strangers to find them. Yet something had brought him this far, and something else, maybe responsibility, maybe stubbornness, told him he couldn't simply walk away from whatever truth sat locked in that cold metal shell. As he approached the box again, he froze. A faint sound drifted from outside, not loud enough to be alarming but distinct enough that it didn't belong to the usual chorus of evening noises. It was the sound of gravel shifting under a slow, careful step. Harold turned off the lamp, letting the kitchen fall into a soft dimness. He stood motionless, listening. Another step. Paused. Then silence thickened against the window glass. For several minutes he waited, muscles tense, breath measured. Eventually, the quiet resumed its usual shape, and the sense of presence outside receded, though not entirely. He forced himself to breathe normally, but a new understanding had taken root. He was no longer the only one involved in this story. Someone else already knew the crate was open. Someone else had begun to watch. He gathered the crate lids, closed the blinds, and placed the lockbox back into a cabinet rather than leaving it exposed. Not because he feared a break-in, but because caution had finally become necessary rather than optional. Before going to bed, Harold paused in the hallway, one hand resting on the light switch. He realized, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the discovery inside the crate had changed more than his routine. It had changed the direction of his days. The weight he had sensed earlier was not anxiety at all. It was the beginning of responsibility, the kind that grows only heavier if ignored. And as he turned off the final light, he understood something else with equal certainty. Tomorrow, whether he liked it or not, the real consequences of opening that crate would begin. The next morning arrived in a muted hush, the kind that settles over a home before the events of the day decide whether to disturb its quiet or honor it. Harold woke earlier than usual, long before the sun pushed its pale light across the bedroom curtains. He lay still for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the heater, letting the familiarity of the sound remind him that not everything in his world was shifting beneath him. Yet even in this early calm he felt a steady pulse of clarity, the kind that only forms after a night spent thinking rather than sleeping. He knew that whatever hid within the lockbox, whatever had drawn the attention of unseen watchers, could no longer be left in the dark corners of his home or the darker corners of his conscience. He brewed his morning coffee with hands that moved slowly but deliberately, the steam rising like a quiet signal that life continued, even when questions outweighed answers. After a long sip, he took the thin metal tool he'd found in the crate lid and knelt beside the locked cabinet where he'd hidden the box. He did not feel excitement or fear, but rather a sense of responsibility, steady and firm, the same feeling he'd once had decades ago when solving problems at the factory where he had worked most of his life. Problems were not solved by ignoring them, they were solved by understanding them. In the garage, he placed the lockbox on the workbench once more, the morning light slanting softly across the metal. The tool slid neatly into the recessed groove, confirming that the original owner had crafted the hidden compartment and this key-like object as a matched set. When he turned the tool, a quiet click echoed through the interior of the box, a measured, deliberate sound that felt more like a sigh of release than a mechanical action. The lid lifted with surprising smoothness, and Harold braced himself for whatever truth would look like. Inside, everything was arranged with meticulous precision. Bundles of cash lined one side, wrapped in older paper bands that had yellowed slightly with age. Not dirty money, not carelessly crammed stacks, but carefully counted and preserved bills, the way someone might keep emergency savings or evidence of past transactions. On the opposite side lay a velvet pouch containing a pocket watch with an engraved backplate bearing a name and date. Beneath it, wrapped in tissue paper, rested a collection of documents. Receipts from pawnshops, handwritten notes, photocopies of official forms, and one sealed envelope stamped with the faded insignia of a law enforcement agency. Harold read only the first few pages before he understood the broad strokes. Whoever owned the crate had once operated on the outer edges of legality, not a hardened criminal, not a mastermind, but someone who had slipped between the cracks of the system and then tried, in their own complicated way, to hold pieces of their life together. The cash represented several years of quiet survival. The documents represented attempts at setting things right or perhaps preparing for a reckoning that never came. Nothing in the lockbox threatened anyone now. The story it told was heavy, yes, but it was a weight from the past rather than a danger in the present. It was, in its own way, a life distilled. He spent several hours documenting everything with the slow, methodical care that had marked this entire journey. He photographed each bundle, scanned every form, and cataloged each piece with notes written in his steady hand. When he finally finished, he packaged the items into 3 groups. One for legal authorities, one for appraisal and potential sale, and one for safekeeping. The process granted him a strange, unexpected peace. The unknown had become knowable, and the fear that had grazed the edges of his days now softened into something more manageable, something he could carry without bending. That afternoon, he drove into town to meet with an attorney recommended by an acquaintance at the senior center. The attorney was a woman with a calm voice and an even calmer presence, someone who had spent years untangling the kinds of stories that ordinary people stumbled into by accident rather than design. She examined the documents, listened patiently to the circumstances, and responded not with alarm but with clear, steady guidance. She confirmed that the cash, under storage auction law, belonged to him legally. The personal items with identifiable family ties could be returned if relatives surfaced, but he was under no obligation to conduct a search beyond notifying the storage facility. The rest, the watch, the rare collectibles found in the crate, the tools, the archival items, could be valued and sold through reputable channels. Her advice dissolved the tension in Harold's shoulders in a way he hadn't realized he needed. The world had not turned dangerous. It had simply asked him to act with care and integrity. And he had. Over the next several weeks, the appraisal process unfolded with its own, almost meditative rhythm. The pocket watch turned out to be a rare model worth far more than Harold had imagined. Several antique items from the crate, including a set of handmade surveying tools and an early edition atlas, drew strong interest from collectors. Even the cash, once verified and counted, amounted to tens of thousands of dollars. Altogether, the value approached the kind of sum that made a difference in a life. Not extravagant, not life-changing in the cinematic sense, but substantial enough to lighten burdens and open doors that had long felt impossible. For a man who had lived modestly, who had stretched retirement dollars with care, who had replaced large dreams with smaller, more manageable ones, the money felt less like fortune and more like permission. Permission to repair the house without postponing the decision for another year. Permission to replace the creaking furnace before winter returned. Permission to take the road trip along the coast he had always imagined but never found practical. Permission to simply breathe without calculating how much each choice would cost. But the greatest relief came from something softer, something quieter. The realization that the shadows he had sensed, the observers, the unnamed watchers, had evaporated. Whether they had belonged to someone connected to the original owner, or whether they had only ever existed in his anxious imagination, their presence faded as the weeks passed without incident. There were no more cars lingering near his home, no more footsteps outside, no more envelopes slipped beneath the door. The silence that returned was not the silence of fear but the silence of closure. The wooden crate remained in his garage, but now it felt less like a mystery and more like a chapter he had finished reading. He kept the watch, the crate lid with the hidden tool, and one old map that depicted the world in soft, faded lines. Everything else found its rightful place, sold, donated, or archived with care. One quiet evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees and cast a warm glow across his living room, Harold sat with a small notebook open on his lap. He wrote down the lessons he felt compelled to remember, that even in the later years of life discovery is possible, that curiosity tempered with wisdom can carry a person through uncertainty, that doing the right thing may not bring applause, but it brings peace, and that sometimes life gives you exactly what you need at the moment you begin to believe such things no longer happen. The money would help him live more comfortably, yes. But the real gift was something deeper, a reminder that age did not make him irrelevant, that decisions still mattered, that he could still rise to meet challenges with dignity and steadiness. And in the weeks that followed, whenever he passed the garage or felt doubt tug softly at his thoughts, he would rest his hand on the crate lid and remind himself that good choices, made patiently and honestly, always guide a person home.